And that's what climate change is about.
We're not live.
All right, there was a glitch. It didn't go live. I'm going to do it one more time.
And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
That's right, Greta. It is Friday, and this is our own personal Friday climate protest. Climate Change Roundtable, episode 91. Climate bulletin, scientists behaving badly. I'm your host, Anthony Watts, Senior Fellow for Environment and Climate at the Heartland Institute. Welcome, everyone. Joining us today, our regular panelist, Dr. H. Sterling Burnett, who is director of the Arthur B. Robinson Center at the Heartland Institute, and special guest Steve Milloy of junkscience.com. Linnea is off today. And by the way, this is our last broadcast for 2023. We will return in 2 weeks on January 5th. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Good to be on.
Yeah, so we have had an interesting week. We've had the end of COP28, thank goodness. That's finally over. But let's kick off the show as we usually do with some of our crazy climate stories. And we're not going to get too deep into the COP28 Snorefest, but we will touch on some topics. And we do have a cartoon. This one I thought was just summed it up perfectly. Hypocrisy. Yes, they're all flying back to their host countries, emitting CO2 into the atmosphere with fossil fuel, jet fuel. And it's all about hypocrisy, and it's all about the money. Comments?
Yeah, that says it all. Picture tells 1,000 words. You could have shown them coming in. You could have shown them tooling around in limos and big SUVs. You could have shown them eating a lot of meat, despite the fact they say we got to get rid of meat for the hoi polloi. It's hypocrisy. You're right about that.
Yeah, I just put this on my X feed. I found a picture of UN Chief Antonio Guterres shaking hands with Putin's natural gas salesman at COP28. And, although like at UN Climate Week, Guterres is, slamming the greed of fossil fuel companies and, all the nasty things he says about deniers and things like that. And here he is shaking hands with Putin's, gas rep.
Well, it always annoys.
Making sure that there is a provision in the COP28 agreement so that Putin can keep selling natural gas as a climate friendly bridge fuel.
It always annoys me about politicians when they just bash people. You go to the debates and they bash each other, and then they say, "My good friend." They tear each other up on the floor of the House, and they say, "My good friend of the senator from blah blah blah,
highly distinguished senator from outer butthole."
To be honest, it was refreshing to see that Vivek and Haley, Haley, they don't. It's like when the debate's over, they don't shake hands. They're not pleasant. At least they're honest about it. Gutierrez trashes these people, and then he's in the back room shaking hands. It's just it's the height of hypocrisy. It tells you all you need to know.
Yeah, but I know that we focus on the hypocrisy of John Kerry and Al Gore and really all of them a lot, because I guess, the public gets really outraged with hypocrisy. But when you think about, the real problem is what they're trying to do. And so our challenge is trying to, educate people on what they're actually trying to do versus, whether John Kerry flies a jet. I mean, the guy's a butthead and he's a hypocrite butthead. Yes. But what he's trying to do is worse.
Yeah. Well, I want to say that all of this hypocrisy shows up in the data, and that's what we're all about here on Climate Change Roundtable. We're about the data. And here, this graph shows the data clearly. Atmospheric CO2 at Mauna Loa Observatory. All these different COP conferences have happened all the way up to Dubai, and nothing has changed. Nothing. And it's not likely to change in the future because, India and China, they're going like gangbusters, producing, new coal plants and new sources of energy, not wind and solar so much, but the regular stuff, fossil fuels. They're just going gangbusters on that, while the Western democracies are being beat into the ground by climate activists saying that we must reduce. And the United States has done so. And much of the EU has done so as well. Carbon dioxide emissions are down since about 2008. But
much to our damage, right? Our electric grids are becoming less reliable and stable. In Texas, where we've got a lot of hydrocarbons and a lot of coal that people don't realize. We produce a lot of coal here in Texas. We used to have coal plants that kept our power online. Now we can't even keep them online regularly in the winter.
Yep.
Not our peak time, by the way. As you might imagine, July and August are peak energy use in Texas, but we can't even keep them online in the winter because we've moved to wind and we've shut down coal. And Europe has done the same. They're driving their industries out. Now, of course, Germany, they started to backpedal. They still talk the talk. Oh, we gotta get rid of fossil fuels, as they open previously shuttered coal plants to keep their power on this winter.
Well, something about that graph. You guys probably talked about this already. The Sultan Al Jaber comments when they. Around the beginning of COP, they tried to take him down with the Zoom call where he's saying that there's no science supporting, the phase out of fossil fuels, get us to 1.5, blah, blah, blah. That was a funny thing to listen to. But, there are other parts of that Zoom call that were, I think, even more important. There's one point where, it's a Zoom call where you can only hear his voice, but you can see like Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, on screen. And, she's hectoring him about leading on phasing out fossil fuels. Yeah. Right. And he gets tired of it. He says, look, let's be realistic here. Let's be adults. You show us the way, you take the lead. And what he missed from that what he missed saying was, Mary Robinson was president of Ireland, which only has 5 million people, which is fewer people than the Washington, D.C. Area that I live in. And if Ireland, can't get rid of fossil fuels for its 5 million people in a relatively temperate country, well, what hope how is anybody else going? So he challenged her to lead. And of course, you can't lead because it's not possible to get rid of fossil fuels. And so that's why you see that graph. And emissions are going to continue to go up, because it's not possible to get rid of fossil fuels. And we're getting more people who want to eat food and want to, live in shelters and want to go places.
You're getting more people in developing countries who want to live like people in Western countries. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what they should aspire to. They should have air conditioning in India.
Well, yeah, at the very least, they're all going to want internet and telephones.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing you don't see pictures from Africa where some guy's got a mud hut and a solar panel on it with an air conditioner. You can't run an air conditioner on a solar panel.
Or a refrigerator keeping his food from going bad. Right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Oh, can you imagine how expensive it would be to have an air conditioner in a breezy hut with no windows or anything? I mean, my God.
All right. Meanwhile, in the middle of all this, energy experts are bashing John Kerry's UN deal to shut down fossil fuels. Yes, At first, they were saying, "Oh no, we can't get rid of fossil fuels," and then they relented and say, "Yeah, we're going to work on a phase out." And then they came up with this sort of milquetoast language about phasing out fossil fuels. But the thing is that
it's not phasing out; it's transitioning.
Okay,
that's
whatever.
Language.
Bottom line is, it's just lip service to the activists. It's not really going to happen. The bottom line is that if you phased out fossil fuels today, the world as we know it would collapse, crash, and burn. There'd be riots in the streets. There would be famine. There would be death. All of this stuff. But well, leave it to the activists to wish for that nirvana.
Look, the cop language has no enforceability. There's no mechanism to enforce it. It's not a phase out. It's not even a phase down. It's a transition. It's a transition over time, depending upon the country. Some countries will transition far beyond 2060 when we've been told 2050, 2035. These are the deadlines. We're dead if we don't do it before then. But they've agreed that, say, China and some other countries get to transition much farther out.
Yeah.
I
want to take this opportunity to label myself as a trans denier.
Well, and if you read that paragraph in the agreement, maybe Andy can bring it up. If you read it, what struck me is not the transition versus phase out language, but the lack of consideration of maintaining anybody's standard of living. It was all about just, fair, equitable, those are all like left-wing terms for
climate justice crap.
Yeah, climate justice crap. Nothing about maintaining your standard of living. And
or advancing your standard of living.
Yes, much less advanced.
Yeah. Well, presumably it'll be just when communism can't make us all equally rich, but it can make us all equally poor.
Yeah.
And I guess if we're all poor and living, this is what Al Jaber said also. He says, look, show me a path where we don't end up living in caves.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of the Rush song Trees, where, the oaks are cut down to be the same level as the maples.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're all kept equal by hatchet, axe, and saw.
Yeah. So while some people are hailing this as, historic, unprecedented, fantastic, because they got the wording in there, even though it means nothing, people like activist Greta Thunberg are complaining. Of course, it's not enough. We have to do more, and we have to do it right now. Right now.
How dare you?
Well, of course, it's not just Greta. Most of the environmental groups think this is nothing was accomplished. This is a wishy-washy agreement. They wanted language that said phase out, and they wanted it before 2050.
Yeah.
They wanted strict deadlines. And, at the conference, 5 lead authors of the UN's most recent report, they displayed a little honesty, and they said, look, you've got to give us the power to prescribe policies and then the power to oversee and make sure 195 nations follow those policies. That's what we need. Yet we can't leave it up to these namby-pamby politicians beholden to democratic elections or the whims of, if they're authoritarians, the whims of whatever they feel at the moment. You got to give us, the scientists, the power.
Right. Speaking of scientists, the other one out there whining about it is Michael Mann. Of course, he whines about everything. That's what he does. That's his superpower, whining. Anyway,
in England they call it whinging.
He calls it weak tea at best. It's just unbelievable. It's Mann, so it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's not any kind of tea. It's just nothing. What do they expect? It's a crazy idea to start with. There's no way to enforce their crazy idea. If they actually got what they wished for, people would be burning climate activists at the stake to stay warm. They learned nothing from, I guess, Maximilian Robespierre. Their sort of extreme desires are just going to wind up in extremism, and they're, in the end, they're going to suffer because people will get tired of it.
I don't know how many of you used to read Dilbert. Now it's gone private. I don't subscribe, but in the old days, they used to have the archives. And you mentioned throwing the environmentalist, the climate activist on the bonfire. There was a cartoon in Dilbert where Dogbert ran an energy company in San Francisco, and he says, "Come join the Dogbert Green Energy Company. We're keeping the lights on with low emissions." And then they showed him with the tech guy, and he had a hippie wrapped up in carpet, and they were throwing him into a furnace.
Yeah, it's like Soylent Green,
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a Dilbert comic here. I'm going to try to find and give this to Andy if I can find it. But yeah, Dilbert has some of the best commentary until it got shut down by the whiners, over whatever racial equity or whatever it was. But Dilbert really centered clearly. Here we go. Let's see if I can share this with Andy. Actually, maybe not. We'll see. Anyway, but point is that there's a lot of good commentary out there about the ridiculousness of some of these climate claims. And as a result, we end up with, I guess, what's the word? We end up with suppression. They don't want to hear this side of it. They can't even handle simple comics sometimes pushing back against this stuff. Yeah. And so as a result, we end up with, suppression.
Well,
there's the one that Sterling was talking about.
Oh gosh, yeah. No, that's not it. That's got Michael Mann.
Oh well, it's still
no. That's a good one. That's a good one too. But I just like the one where Dogbert's selling his green energy and he's throwing hippies into a furnace.
Anthony, imagine what's going on in their own heads. I mean, they're trying to suppress us, but imagine the common sense that they're trying to suppress in their own brains. Michael Mann is not a stupid person. Okay, he can look around and see that everything depends on fossil fuels. He can see that wind and solar don't really work, that EVs are, nobody wants them, they're expensive, inconvenient. And, we don't know something that they don't know, but they suppress what they know because they have some other goal. And I wonder, the blood pressure it's got to be getting to them. They got to want to explode with,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know. Sometimes I wonder, what is his game? I mean, he's got to see this stuff, but is it just, is he playing a role? Is he deluding himself? Does he really believe the stuff he says? It's hard to say. Anyway, enough about Mann. Get this. There's this, it was only a matter of time before they started going after humans exhaling CO2 and other noxious greenhouse gases like methane. Stop breathing, you useless proles. That's what they're saying here. Next, they're going to want to stop Christmas, They have a scientific study now complaining about humans and CO2.
Well, I think this is about nitrous oxide, and it wasn't CO2. I mean, they hadn't even gotten to CO2, right? In this study. I mean, humans exhale at 40,000 ppm, right? And this study, I don't think talks about that. It talks about, I think Andy, can you scroll up a little bit? I think it's nitrous oxide. Methane.
Yeah. Can you imagine that at some time in the future they're going to have low activity Fridays, in honor of Greta, where people are just not going to be able to run around outside. You have to sit in your chairs and just be like this.
Well, no, but look, if you want to be taken seriously, how dumb is it to publish a study claiming that breathing causes global warming? Right? I mean,
well, I think
it's something that I would publish a study saying breathing causes global warming because I'm trying to make fun of them. But they publish it as if it's like, you need to take this seriously.
Look, we've had people ask us about that, and the truth is, if you believe greenhouse gases cause danger, I don't care about global warming. I care about dangerous global warming. If you believe greenhouse gases cause dangerous global warming, and you've added 3 or 4 billion people in the last century to the globe exhaling, then they're contributing. I mean, it's logical.
Yeah.
So the logical solution is to control population, which a lot of them want to do.
Yeah. I have a quote somewhere from Steve Snyder, who's one of the, in the global warming pantheon, where he said that there should be no CO2 in the atmosphere.
Idiot.
Right.
It's just nuts, their whole viewpoint on this. And the bottom line is that there's just not a lot of contribution by humans in the atmosphere. I mean, there's the oceans contribute far more, and they're outgassing with warming, and that's been the big debate, because it tends to show up on the ice cores that the CO2 levels lag the temperature, so that the temperature hasn't been increased first. We have this Climate at a Glance article I authored a couple of months ago that talks about the human contributions, to greenhouse gases, and if you scroll down there at the very last kind of pie chart, you'll see that it's minimal, it's minuscule. And this includes, the automobiles and burning and everything else, not to mention the breath. Only 3.4% is of human origin in the whole scheme of things. And even less of that is from breathing. And the whole thing is just, it's all about control,
Yeah. So, we're told that every emission warms the planet. And that CO2 emissions drive warming. NOAA just did its recent its monthly data release, and if you look at, like, for the United States, the last 12 months are cooler than the same 12-month period 25 years ago, despite 1 trillion tons of emissions. And I know that it's global warming, not America warming. But, even so, in America, we are told that every emission is bad and warms the planet. But how can, in 25 years, today, the last 12 months was cooler than 25 years ago? What's the explanation for that if every emission warms everything?
Yeah, what is the explanation? All right, let's move on to our next topic.
The explanation is don't care about facts. It's
Christmas. It seems like about every year, this time of year, we get these stories saying that Christmas is the warmest ever, or there's no snow for Christmas, and climate change is the cause. And oh no, St. Nick isn't going to be able to get out of the North Pole because, whatever. They're going to ground the reindeer because they produce too much methane or something. So here's the data. And again, we're all about data here. This is from the CO2 Coalition. They published it this week. For the United States, and again, the United States isn't the world, but for the lower 48 states, the trend for Christmas temperatures since 1895 is down. It's getting colder on Christmas Day, while CO2 is going up.
Shocking.
Hard facts.
Well, I guess at least kids in the U.S. are safe for their kids, for their presents on Christmas, right? Yeah, those poor people in Russia right now, where they're suffering at 70 below zero, below freezing, where they're dying because their power plants are failing. They'll get those presents because there's snow there. But
and so it's interesting because this data is from the U.S. Historical Climate Network. A lot of which the data is just made up and made up to cool the past and warm the present, and they can't even do it. They can't even manage to make it work for them.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And that's what we do here. We do this at climaterealism.com. We do it on our show here. We always go to the data, and almost without fail, when you go in the data and look at it objectively, not magnified, not stretched, not massaged, not edited, straight data, there's no crisis. It just doesn't show up. All right. Speaking of crisis, in Oslo, Norway, they're having a crisis with buses. Yes, the new fantastic super duper electric buses can't handle the cold. This follows many other stories we've covered, like they can't handle the cold for electric snow plows in New York City. What an idea.
This is honestly my favorite story of the week. Only a bureaucrat or a politician blinded by green rhetoric could think that you have a public transit system And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that it's run on electric buses in Oslo, a place that's pretty dadgum cold for a large part of the year. Batteries, oh, that's a good idea. Batteries don't drain in the cold. And so now all these people are stranded. Either they got on the bus and the bus stops, or they're waiting at bus stops in the cold and the snow in Oslo, waiting for the bus to come. And then they're being told, sorry, for the foreseeable future, there are no buses. So what's going to happen? How they get to work, how they get to shopping, how they do all the things that they did using public transit. I'll tell you, they'll drive cars. So you'll have a lot of new emissions, more emissions than if they kept with diesel buses in the first place. They're idiots.
This is what happens when politicians engineer infrastructure instead of engineers and scientists.
I think you guys are missing the upside. And the upside is they didn't catch on fire.
Yet. No, yet.
My favorite video is the German buses, the whole line just kept on fire. These died.
I have a feeling.
In a photo.
I have a feeling when they're coated with feet of snow in the garage, that's only a matter of time, because water incursion is one of those things that sparks those fires pretty quickly.
Now, I wonder if the Oslo bus service or the Norwegian or whoever is in charge I wonder if they've learned a lesson, if they're going to go back to diesel buses. Or
they probably will, but they won't announce it, because that would be to admit failure. And politicians never admit failure, right?
I think they must have. I think from the stories that I read, I think rather than keeping their diesel buses, mothballing them and keeping them in a warehouse somewhere in case you needed backup, I think they got rid of them because they're talking about not having bus service for weeks on end. If you just had the buses in a warehouse, you could just drive them out. No, they're saying, sorry, we don't have buses.
I love that.
I just think it's crazy. Only like Anthony said, only a politician who doesn't know anything about engineering.
Yeah. What's interesting is right next to them there's a dumpster fire going on.
Well, I wonder
Sparked by the vehicles.
Yeah. I wonder if before the Oslo government bought these buses, whether they checked around to see what happened in Los Angeles or Albuquerque is there any city in the world where these buses work? I know Los Angeles, I think, bailed out of them. Albuquerque bailed out of them. Do they work in China? I know that a lot of these buses come from China. Do they even work there? What's the deal?
Yeah. Anyhow, so finally, our crazy climate news of the week comes from the AGU convention. I used to go to this on a regular basis. I went there to see what science was doing, climate science was doing, but they kind of threw me out after I took a picture of someone that they didn't want me to take a picture of, even though it was in the hallway, So I don't get press credentials there anymore. But I'll tell you this, I don't miss it, because look at what they're doing this week at the AGU meeting. It's really a clown fest. The scientist rebellion versus the extinction rebellion. I mean, watch. This is just hilarious.
Scientists, visitors, we have a special treat for you. A short 5-minute play in which a fed up and desperate scientist tries to pull down an oil derrick. A demented do-gooder with a degree? What's their story? We now go to the scientist who tied a rope to an oil derrick.
I need to dismantle this sucker and maybe all the derricks everywhere before time runs out on the good old earth. For 40 years, and he just keeps laughing and making cha-ching noises. I gotta do something.
Hey, stop that. If you pull down even one of the oil derricks, you'll be reducing America's energy security, let alone cutting our company profits. What are you a patriotic American or what?
I am patriotic.
Yeah.
I want to keep
trying
us
to
from
topple
frying and
oil and
burning.
gas, having a tug of war. I mean, good Lord. This is science at AGU. Science in the wild, I guess you could call it. And they've got Velma from the Scooby-Doo show there.
Yeah, there you
the
go.
thing.
Velma from Scooby-Doo. She's been, and I don't know when the last time. Look, I don't develop oil wells, but I don't know when the last time I saw a derrick like that in the field.
Yeah, I think the last movie they saw was Giant.
Exactly.
Look, if these people are so smart, why haven't they developed an alternative? I mean, if it's so easy to do, so cost effective, we're going to save all kinds of money and, everything. Why don't they do it?
Well, Steve, they have. Haven't you read all the studies where they have these wedges? They have 18 wedges that replace all fossil fuels. And all we have to do is implement them. All we have to do is more wind, more solar, more batteries, carbon, get all these wedges together. They've been, look, they work so well and they lower our prices so much that our prices are going up and our power is failing. And yet we're constantly told by the media that they're cheaper than fossil fuels.
Yeah.
That they can work, that we can have everything we've got now. But sans fossil fuels, that everything will keep running. And the only thing battling against the rhetoric are the facts on the ground where our power grid is failing and we can't keep the lights on and our meat's thawing out in the freezer and our prices just keep going up.
Yeah.
Only reality stands between us.
This goes back to that COP28 video, show us how this works. Find a place, make it work someplace. It doesn't work anywhere, not even California.
Nope, it does not. It does not. All right. So enough of this. I want to get to not to the ClimateGate stuff yet. I want to get to a video that we produced here at the Heartland Institute. It had to do with climate at a glance. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen it or not, but we have this fantastic website. I'm the primary author, climateataglance.com. And we have all these different topics where we go in with data scientifically and we debunk these claims, about, the Atlantic current stopping or, going into runaway greenhouse gases or whatever.
Hurricanes,
and so forth and so on.
All that stuff.
Yeah, and so we've started doing videos. Our colleague Linnea, who is not with us today, has produced a video going on to the first topic. And this has to do with the polar vortex. Is it caused by global warming? I want to run it for you. Here it is.
Hey everyone, this is Linnea Lucan, Research Fellow at the Heartland Institute's Arthur B. Robinson Center on Climate and Environmental Policy, here with a quick climate fact check on cold snaps and the polar vortex, using research from our Climate at a Glance for Teachers and Students book, which you can find in print and online at climateataglance.com. I'm sitting in South Carolina, and it's actually pretty chilly at this time of year, but not too bad. Other places across the country and Europe have seen some early cold snaps, and even snow. Wichita, Kansas just had the second snowiest November day since 1888. These kinds of cold snaps are often blamed on climate change, but data refutes claims that climate change is causing extremely cold temperatures or increasing the number or strength of polar vortex events. Let's look at the facts. Right off the bat, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says in their climate assessment that it's very likely that there have been fewer extremely cold days and nights in recent decades, and is virtually certain that this trend in declining extreme cold will continue. Likewise, in the United States, data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, as I'll say from now on, show that extreme cold events have not increased. But what about the polar vortex? Well, not every cold snap is due to the polar vortex, and misinformation is being spread about what's actually going on with it. While you might hear the term polar vortex more nowadays in the news than in the past, it actually was first described in 1853. The vortex itself is a naturally occurring circulation pattern of low-pressure, cold air on the north and south poles. Sometimes it gets less stable, it wobbles and sends cold air south. But as discussed in the Heartland Institute's educational booklet, Climate at a Glance, long-term observational data undermines claims that such events have become more frequent or severe. Even computer models that are specifically trying to tie polar vortex events to global warming produce inconsistent and contradictory results. A polar vortex outbreak is an individual weather event, which is not something that can be directly attributed to climate change. To make that link, we would have to see a consistent long-term trend, but there is no new trend in the frequency or severity of polar vortex events. That's it for this video. If you want more information and our references and sources, please check out climateatglance.com, where you can find pages about cold spells, the polar vortex, and even snowpack, as well as get a digital copy of the book so that you can read it yourself. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, if you haven't gotten a copy of that book, get it. It makes a great Christmas gift, by the way, for someone you really want to irritate. Just buy it on Amazon.com and have it drop shipped to them directly, and then watch their heads explode. Facts.
Humbug.
All right. So let's get into our main topic, climate bullying, scientists behaving badly. And I want to go back to the ClimateGate era. This is one of the most famous emails. This is from Phil Jones and to Dr. Michael Mann. Mike, I can't see either of these papers being in the next IPCC report. Kevin and I will keep them out somehow, even if we have to redefine what the peer review literature is. Wow, what hubris. Yeah, and so, you know, we saw in the ClimateGate, there was a whole series of these kinds of comments, you know. They're talking about the death of skeptic John Daly, for example. In an odd way, this is cheering news, according to Phil Jones. And, you know, then they're bashing climate audit. I looked at some of the stuff on the climate audit website. I'd really like to talk to a few of those auditors in a dark alley, says Ben Santer. Next time I see Pat Michaels at a scientific meeting, I'm tempted to beat the crap out of him. These are scientists. Yes, indeed. And then Michael Mann claims that a journalist, to a journalist at the McKittrick and McIntyre paper, is pure scientific fraud. Ah, my goodness. So the point is that the hubris of these scientists, the ones that are in this sort of like climate club, the ones at the top of the food chain when it comes to climate science, they have vicious and nasty reactions and ideas to things that challenge their work. They're not really being true scientists if they're not allowing their work to be challenged. They don't want contradictory peer review publications to be discussed or vetted or talked about, because, you know, that would undermine their vision. They suffer from this noble cause corruption where, you know, we're saving the planet. We need to get this other stuff out of there or the planet's not going to be saved. That's their whole viewpoint on things. Yeah. And so that's the problem that we faced. We were first exposed in 2009, and today it's not gotten any better, because in the last week we had yet another eruption of such things happening. You know, they used to call, what was it, in the Clinton era, a bimbo eruption? Was that it? I think. So we've got, I don't know, what should we call it when scientists, climate scientists, are trying to suppress peer review? What kind of eruption would that be?
Yeah. You know, this is not new to climate. I don't know exactly how far back it goes. It might go back to Newton. I think Newton, he had problems with, was it Leibniz and who developed calculus, and it was pretty nasty. Scientists are just regular people. And you know, they're subject to or you know, they're subject to dishonesty in politics and all the things that affect all of us. They're not, you know, people tend to think of them as honest people in lab coats, and they're not. I remember early in my career, EPA issued a report called "Safeguarding the Future," where they said science should not be driven by policy. And of course, that's all EPA is all about: policy-driven science. And climate is the same thing. They made up their mind a long time ago. They don't care what the facts are. And it's all about just, getting their policy outcome and twisting the science, or, blocking critics, which is what ClimateGate was really all about. It's awful.
Dwight Eisenhower warned of this day back in his farewell address. Everyone remembers the farewell address for his statements about the military-industrial complex. But the latter half of his speech is all about the science, the capture of science by government and government by elite scientists. We started funding. The government first started really funding big science during the nuclear, when they were trying to develop nuclear. And they've been funding it ever since. And so politics dictates what scientists do. And scientists are increasingly dictating what politicians do. If the climate alarm disappeared tomorrow, all that funding, I keep hearing, I've heard it said dozens, if not hundreds of times, the science is settled. And every time I say to a scientist, okay, if the science is settled, you don't need any more money to study climate change anymore. We'll shift that funding just to engineering problems to solve the problem. They suddenly say, no. We still gotta study it. We still got more things to know. Well, then it's not settled if you've got more things to know. That's when you know it's not settled. That's when you know that it's all about the gravy train. And Eisenhower warned of this. It's more prescient, and his warning more important now than ever.
Yeah, I think, the vast majority of science is funded by the government, which means the vast majority of science is completely politicized. And until we get government funding out of science, science is lost.
Yeah, plus that it's become tribal. It really has. If you're not with us, you're against us kind of a viewpoint when it comes to science. So this past week, Dr. Roger Pielke Jr. posted something that was pretty shocking. And he says here, this smoking gun information was just shared with me. A leading climate scientist, who could that be, improperly obtained a pre-submission paper of mine, contacted the journal editor where it would be submitted, and told him to assign specific hostile reviewers to ensure the paper would not get published. Yeah. And of course, it did not. Surprise, surprise. And then he goes on to say, that I have the undeniable smoking gun in the words of the gatekeeper, and I've requested permission to share this information publicly. We shall see. Well, so far it's been several days and hasn't shown up, but it's bad. I've learned a lot over the years about the shenanigans, but I guess it's just part of the iceberg above the surface. And he's basically referring to, he's got just one little piece of it here in this one little paper that they're trying to get yanked out before it even gets a fair review in the peer review. There's much more of this kind of stuff going on. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of something from Michael Mann, like I have, you know what I'm talking about.
Well, I think it's just that Roger Pielke Jr. was not willing to pay the journals enough to publish it, because as I wrote a couple of weeks ago in Climate Change Weekly, research shows that the top journals are pay for publish. You have to give them money for your journal article. They make money on the back end and the front end. People subscribe, and people who want to get published pay them to publish. Now, it still goes through peer review, but do you think if you don't pay them, it's going to get much of a good peer review? It certainly won't get published, because they don't publish anything that's not paid. So
yeah, it sounds like a case of money talks and bullshit gets published.
It's incredible that, what is it now, 14 years after ClimateGate, this is still going on, right? If your paper is not politically correct, somebody will learn about it and have it spiked. It's just really shocking. A few months ago, was it that researchers from Johns Hopkins admitted that he's an alarmist. He's not a normal or an honest person, but he said that even he had to tailor his papers for climate alarmism to get them published in Nature. Right?
Yeah. He said we took out all this stuff that would have caused problems because it wasn't alarmist enough to get it published. And he said that that's a problem. I mean, he admitted that that's a problem for science. Yeah, but another around the same time, a science journal withdrew a paper that had been published a year and a half ago. It had been cited 40 or 50 times, but it didn't get any attention. You know, who cares if an academic cites something? Nobody reads the academic journals except for other scientists. What happened was that an Australian politician got a hold of it and publicized it. And then suddenly the Guardian and Agence France Presse and others started publicizing it. And suddenly people the scientists were complaining about, how could you publish this? And they did a new review and they withdrew it. Yeah. It passed peer review. Yeah. It was withdrawn, not because they said anything was factually wrong, but they said, well, in light of people complaining, we've lost confidence in it.
So I think there's maybe a little bit hope on the horizon for this issue. One of Heartland's experts is Stan Young, who's a statistician from North Carolina. Stan has a lawsuit pending right now in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. It has to do with EPA and particulate matter, which is tangentially related to climate. It's not a climate issue, but it's still about how, you know, EPA created this stacked, you know, peer review panel to push through their science agenda. And I think that, you know, Stan's basic argument is that, well, when Congress told EPA to do peer review of their science, they meant honest peer review, not rigged peer review. So, you know, if Stan can pull out a win on that case, or even if it has to go to the Supreme Court to get a win there, you know, maybe that'll start putting some of these institutions on notice that, you know, we're going to require legitimate science to go forward.
Yeah,
you know, and it's this problem with peer review is that it's basically become power review, and like I said, it's about tribalism. If you're not with us, you're against us. Yeah, and so this and one of the common arguments out there by climate alarmists is, well, there's nothing in the peer-reviewed literature that contests this. Well, the problem is that there's so many gatekeepers, we can't get anything in the peer review literature, or very seldom, or it gets published in a minor journal because the prominent journals don't want to touch it because they are lambasted by this clique of tribal climate scientists that are putting on pressure constantly to keep out those papers somehow, because we're going to redefine what peer review literature is.
Yeah.
Well, you know, what amazes me, so I produce Climate Change Weekly 3 times a month, and what amazes me is I still find journals publishing skeptical papers every week. Yeah, they squeeze through. They don't say, mind you, none of these papers say humans aren't causing climate change. No single paper could prove that. They say, well, it turns out that the Arctic's not warming. That we've got the measurements, the Arctic's not warming. Well, that is a foundation that is knocked out from under the argument. Oh, well, it turns out that subsurface volcanic activity is having an impact on heat blobs in the ocean that are measured. Well, that knocks out a pillar of the monolithic climate narrative. It turns out that hurricanes haven't been increasing or in number or severity. Well, that knocks out a pillar. Now, some of these papers say that, but then they have a disclaimer at the end, which they shouldn't have to publish, but they do. And the disclaimer is, yeah, hurricanes aren't getting worse, but we're not saying climate change isn't happening. No. It just doesn't show up in our data.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they are getting published, but like you say, not in Nature, not in Science, not in those pay-for-play journals, not in the top journals.
Well, and they get no media attention, right? I mean, if the 3 of us and maybe a handful of others don't draw attention to them, no one finds out about them. And they're really important papers. You know, the papers that show that Greenland was ice-free, 100,000 years ago. Well, how could that be with pre-industrial CO2 levels if every emission warms the planet? What's going on there? These are all important papers, like Sterling says, and I guess we're the ones we need to find out about them, because not all the study authors are in our group, and we need to publicize them.
Yeah, and you know, the bottom line is that natural variation, the study of natural variation, has been pushed aside. Literally, the climate scientists out there think that carbon dioxide is the only control knob for climate. There's literally hundreds of things that are involved in how the climate changes over time. I mean, there's Milankovitch cycles, there's solar output, there's all these other things, and yet they just push that aside because it's only carbon dioxide. What a scam to think that only one thing controls a complex system like Earth's climate.
Just to show, Anthony, that's not an exaggeration at all. This week, after the COP28 agreement was reached, Alden Meyer, who is a longtime climate alarmist, he was outraged by the failure to phase out fossil fuels. He said emissions or CO2 drives everything in the atmosphere. Everything that happens depends on CO2. I mean, it was that clear, and that's exactly what they want everyone to believe. That big yellow thing in the sky and the white things that go by don't matter. It's just the invisible trace gas.
Yeah, water vapor, the dominant greenhouse gas by not just orders of magnitude. I mean, was it 97, 98% of the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is water vapor. That has, ignore the man behind the curtain, folks. It has nothing to do with this. Even though, when Mauna Loa, I think was it Mauna Loa that exploded? No, Huttatonga that exploded last year, put 10% more water vapor, not a small amount, but 10% more into the atmosphere, and suddenly temperatures were up. But that has nothing whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting. There was a paper published last month. I think we put it in the November Climate Fact Check, which we published, about how the Huttatonga volcano had a massive effect on the atmosphere. And in the study article, the only thing they mentioned that it affected was the ozone layer. It had this massive effect, but had no effect on weather or climate. I mean, those two words were not in the article at all.
Right. But they were in some earlier articles on that, and I wrote about them once again in Climate Change Weekly a couple of months ago. I'll leave it there.
Yeah. It just, they ignore everything else except for carbon dioxide. And Josh, our favorite resident cartoonist at What's Up With That and many other places, did one of my favorite cartoons ever on climate control knobs. Climate scientists discover that oceans have a major influence on global temperatures. Look, I found one that does oceans. Literally, that's what climate science is about today. They think that CO2, that little knob in the lower left, compared to everything else, is the big kahuna of climate drivers and control, when in fact there's so many, many other things. All right, let's go on to questions. We've got a few.
Well, just one thing before we do that. So when I put together Climate Change Weekly, because I do find these studies, about half my job is just doing searches and searches and searches through different journals and through different postings, trying to find, is there an article out there? Is there an article out there? It's not easy. That takes as long probably as writing up the summary sometimes. So that tells you how obscure some of this stuff is, but it doesn't make it wrong. In the end, science is driven by facts and data. And if a theory conflicts with facts, then it's the theory that should be questioned, not the data.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Sterling. All right, let's go on to some of our questions. Kenneth asks, has anyone ever seen CO2 harm any living organism or overheat anything in the biosphere? Well, I will say that there was a lake eruption in Africa about a decade or so ago, where carbon dioxide had been sequestered at the bottom of the lake under pressure, and there was an earthquake or something that disturbed it, and all this carbon dioxide bubbled up to the top of the lake and created a gas that flowed over the landscape, and it killed people and livestock. It was very tragic. So that's the only instance I know of where carbon dioxide has actually harmed someone. But that is an aberration. But as far as overheating anything, I don't know of any. Do you guys?
I'm still waiting for the direct scientific evidence that emissions are causing any warming at all. And maybe that's an extreme position. I don't know.
You measure.
I'm getting more fundamentalist in my questioning.
You measure CO2 in closed environments like submarines and other closed environments, and you find out it's much higher, well, 10 times above atmospheric levels of CO2. Nobody's harmed. The one thing I could think of, Anthony, you mentioned the lake. It's not terrestrial. I think it was Apollo 11 where the air filters went
Apollo
out.
13.
Apollo 13, and the CO2 started to climb, and they were having some problems, but they got it solved and they got back down. In the end, the CO2 levels reached much higher levels than atmospheric carbon dioxide, and every one of those guys came down and they were alive.
Yeah. Well, I think the public has exactly the backwards view of the hypothetical effect of emissions in the atmosphere. They imagine that more emissions means more warming, when in fact it's really just sort of the opposite. There's only so much warming that leaves the Earth, and the more CO2 you have in the atmosphere, the less of it. There's less warming to trap. So at some point, CO2 just becomes irrelevant. Now, at what point that happened may have happened long ago. Once it gets hard, I guess to know for sure. But I'm just waiting for it's their burden to show me that emissions are warming or doing anything.
All right, next question. William Shugart asked, CO2 is responsible for many things, including life on planet Earth. Well, that's not really a question, but it's true. If we removed all of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, as some of these enviro nutcases advocate, Earth's life would stop, period. And we came very close to it back during the Ice Age, when CO2 dropped precipitously. If it got down below 150 parts per million, plant life would stop functioning because there's not enough partial vapor pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere to sustain photosynthesis. The plants would die. If the plants die, everything else goes with it. All right, next question. Bogus. Anthony, if there is so much passion over AGW, why is the percentage of climate stations not reporting climbing? I think what he means is physical weather stations. Well, that's a good question. A lot of it had to do with there's been attrition. For example, a good example is the Defense Early Warning Line, the DEW line that went through Canada. It was a series of radar stations up along the far Great White North edge of Canada. And each one of these had a weather station. And they were reporting, but they all got closed when the DEW line got closed. And there has been more weather stations closed than have been opened over the last 20 years. In fact, they've fallen significantly. And this has to do with encroachment. I mean, sometimes they just simply, something builds up around it. A new shopping center goes in and they have to get rid of the weather station that used to be in this farmland there. This happens more often than you think. And that's one of the biggest problems that I point out in my study last year, corrupted climate stations, which you could find on the Heartland Institute website at heartland.org. But a lot of these stations have been so encroached upon by development that there's no place left to put them. And they get closed. A perfect example is the one at the University of Arizona in Tucson. They ended up in a parking lot in front of the Atmospheric Sciences Department. Well, when it started back around 1850 or so, this was a land-grant university. They had all kinds of fields and open space, and that's where the weather station was. But as they built more buildings, got more grants to build more infrastructure, and so forth and so on, the station kept getting moved. Finally, there was no place left to put it, so they put it in the freaking parking lot. And I'm happy to report that I'm responsible for getting this station closed because it was reporting erroneous temperatures.
So, Anthony, one of the things that started to bother me recently is this use of the word record. Record temperatures and, the temperature record going back to global temperature record going back to 1850. There's no such thing as a global temperature record going back to 1850. I'm not even quite sure there's really a record as what I consider the word record to mean in the satellite era. I mean, there's a lot of guesswork that's going on. And estimates and guesswork, to my mind anyway, do not equal record. And when he claimed to set temperature records against really just estimates, is that a record or is that just, I mean, what is it? It's just an estimate. Everything is just an estimate.
Well, the biggest problem with records is that the environment in which the records have been measured has changed over the past 100 years. And so it's like if you were to do a scientific experiment where you've got a thermometer in a jar of water, and you just want to see what happens to that temperature over time, and something builds up around it, someone puts a heat plate in the laboratory next to it, or someone opens the window and the sunlight's shining on the thermometer, or someone closes the window and the sunlight gets shut off. That environment has changed, and it's not the same as the starting conditions. And so when stuff like that happens, is it really a record, or is it just a matter of influences? But yes, it may be a record mathematically or statistically, but is it relevant? I think not. A lot of climate science out there these days is basically massaging of data and statistical analysis. The temperature of the Earth, for example, is nothing but a statistical construct. And it's the same way with the satellite record. It is a statistical construct. Different satellites and so forth are merged together to create this record. And so it's a guesstimate.
Even the ice cores, right? They measure different ratios of CO2 to other things. And then the assumption is those ratios match certain temperatures.
Yeah. Well,
it's not a direct measurement. And we do.
We've lost Sterling.
Okay. Well, I'll pick up. So, I mean, my concern is, this NOAA graph that goes back to 1850 and presents global temperature. Like there's some place that you can take the global temperature and they've done it with almost a digital readout. So they know exactly what it is, when in fact, there are hardly any weather stations covering. Well, there were no weather. There was no global coverage in 1850. Maybe the Eastern United States we knew something about, maybe Europe, maybe some of Australia, maybe some parts of Asia a little bit, but generally speaking,
nothing in the Arctic, nothing in Antarctica.
Yeah, nothing to build a global temperature from. Yet NOAA presents this as it is like there was a digital readout from 1850, and it's just false. And you don't even get to global coverage like with satellites until 1979. And then the satellites, they've got their own issues. And everything is presented as this is the record, and it's not a record, it's just a fantasy.
But if you want to have they done a scientific experiment that's sort of testable? And I think they have. They set up the reference network, right? And the reference network is sort of the control group. So you look at the reference network and you look at the urban heat island affected ones, and you compare the temperatures. And guess what? The control group doesn't show dramatic warming. It shows less than half the warming of the non-control group.
Well, recently it showed nothing, isn't that right? I mean, you've got that on your on What's Up With That, the USHCN. It's fairly embarrassing for the hypothesis that emissions drive warming.
Yeah. So we got one final question that we want to put up there, and then we're going to wrap up the show. Dolger Hansky asked, and he gave a super chat and donated $45 because, we're not getting enough from big oil. Didn't a reasonably published Norwegian state-funded study conclude that CO2 isn't contributing to heating of the planet? Yes, there was a study, and it was done by their statistical organization, and we covered it on Climate Realism. They basically came to the conclusion that there is no evidence that carbon dioxide is heating Earth's atmosphere, especially in a catastrophic way. And of course, that's being panned because that's, it's pushing against the narrative, and it's pushing against funding when you publish stuff like that.
Well, and that report from the Norwegian Statistics Bureau also criticized the notion of global warming. At any given point, it's warmer here, cooler there. In the United States, cooler last 12 months, cooler than the same period of 1997, 1998. I mean, it's a global warming is a non-physical concept. There's no place to measure global warming at. It's just this fantasy calculation. It's like climate PlayStation almost. And I was really pleased to see that report because it just sort of validated all these, all the things we've been saying all these years. And it's from Norway, which is the Norwegian government, which is a very green government.
Yeah, but they've got buses there that run on electric.
But they don't catch on fire yet.
Not yet.
All right. That's all we have time for today. Thank you, Steve Milloy and Sterling Burnett, for joining us here today. Thank you to our viewers for joining us. I want to point out that we will be off for 2 weeks for the Christmas holiday. We will return on January 5th, and we'll have a brand spanking new topic then. So, thanks again for joining us. I wish you all to have a very Merry Christmas, a great Friday, and a fantastic weekend. I'm Anthony Watts, Senior Fellow for the Heartland Institute, wishing you goodbye and so long.